Episode 2, The Path of Jeniah. It's rush hour in New York, and something has everyone's attention. Groups of onlookers are gawking at information that is being broadcast onto the big screen in Times Square. Yellow taxis are beeping horns incessantly at scores of people losing concentration whilst crossing the busy roads. It's amazing how the heads of people seem to bob up and down whilst bodies seem to move left and right, with the occasional person increasing their speed, dodging in between gaps. On foot and clearly in a frantic rush, in all the bustle, you can see a man who seemed to be running later than everybody else. At the traffic lights, he was squeezing his way through several shoulders. His shirt was a grey sort of white, haggard by his squeezing. He had a desperate look on his face, with a briefcase tucked tightly under arm and papers showing. He looked left and right, poised for the changing of the red light to green, determined to get ahead of the other pedestrians. Most people seemed to be to and fro, heading from one building to the other. Buildings were distances away from each other. Irrespective of the melee of slow-moving traffic and horns, as soon as the lights changed, streams of committed people seemed to flood from out of nowhere and began committing from place to place, and the man disappeared amongst a sea of bodies. Among them, a young lady who seemed to be in her own world, crossing the street. She seemed unfazed by the gawking of the commuters, with their eyes fixed on the big screen. Everybody seemed to be saying something on their cell phone devices or to the person next to them. Mouths moved rapidly with twists, and many expressions of giddiness or laughter would also raise up now and then. But it was mostly a bustling noise of vehicles, chatterboxes and footsteps crossing at the lights diagonally, towards and away from the big screen. The screen seemed to captivate more and more commuters with its details. This young lady thought nothing of it, as she stepped off the sidewalk and onto the street, as if to cross it to the other side. She seemed a little dazed by the sprawling of people about her, and even in the middle of the road, her shyness seemed to make her shrink away from the movement of everything else. Though she continued with her head down and feet close together, taking small steps that seemed to be cut off by someone else's walking. "Excuse me, sorry," she would say every other second. Pardon me." No one seemed to pay any attention, return her any courtesy of any sort. Then suddenly, halfway across the street, she jumps in fright to the screeching of car tires and a loud car horn. "Come on, get out of the way! Are you crazy? I could have squashed you! Never saw an impeachment process before!" bellowed a taxi driver with his head hanging out of the window, wiping sweat off his day from his forehead with a grey-looking handkerchief, whilst also shaking his fist. The young lady, scared by the sudden impact of the mixture of sounds from the tires and the taxi driver's voice, apologized several times in a high-pitched tone that seemed to lift no further than her outstretched hand. "Sorry, I'm really sorry," she exclaimed, before carrying her face behind her hands and scurrying more quickly towards the opposite sidewalk. As she got closer towards the sidewalk, lifting her head, she noticed a magazine stand directly in front of her, called the Gazette, and by it a man in a hat seated, with a quirky smile on his face, reading a magazine. He neither seemed too bothered with the rest of the commuters' rush, nor proactive about promoting any magazines for sale. Instead, he sipped at a cup of what seemed to be a hot beverage before placing it down to have another read at his pages. Maybe it was his smile which seemed personal to himself, or his seated position that gave her a sense of security, and it made her feel safer to head that direction after her traffic scare incident just now. As she approached the sidewalk, words and an image caught her attention from a distance. She became intrigued by the front cover of one of the magazines on the stall, so walked towards her intrigue onto the sidewalk. She slowed down a little and looked right to check to see if the seated man with the hot drink was still as approachable as she first saw, as if he was suddenly going to rise up out of his seat and confront for some additional reason to add to her ordeal with the taxi driver. Maybe he too would consider her squishable for her manner of walking in the road, seemingly unawares. However, he didn't. He simply stopped reading momentarily, looked up and says, "Don't look so scared. That guy's a douche. Take a look at whatever you want, okay? Here's a free smile." This acceptance from the stall owner caught her off guard, as no one tended to take her seriously, and she became timid to confrontation because of it. So all that she managed to utter was, "Sorry, I mean, thanks." The man again smiled and shook his head, and continued to observe the magazine he was reading. Still timid in her surroundings, she turned again at the magazine image that caught her eye from a distance whilst crossing the street, and noticed the words, "There is life elsewhere." Next to the words, there was a picture of what looked like outer space with some obscure colours that looked like the headlights of cars and traffic lights at night. She wondered what this could mean and began to remember how she had seen such an arrangement of lights a while back in a night sky from the window of her back garden. This was during a thunderstorm, which was bizarre, seeing as it was unusual for storms to occur in New York that time of year. She read the front cover some, and the world seemed to phase into a blur around her, and she leaned forward to focus in on the smaller writing on the lower part of it and began to read in her head. Scientists at NASA announced that one of their probes that had been missing for 6 months on exploration in the upper atmosphere of Earth has reappeared with strange markings on the side of the probe which suggest it had been... "Interesting, ain't it?" interrupts the seated man with a soft and pretty tone. "That article comes out today, and instead it's overshadowed by this impeachment of the president. If that ain't double jeopardy, then what is, huh?" She stops reading instantly and pops back, standing up straight, beginning to utter out another apology. Sorry, I was just..." But before she could finish, the man reassures her, saying, "All news is old news." He asks her for her name, of which she answers, "I'm Jeniah." He then goes on to greet Jeniah, tipping the edge of his hat with 2 fingers, and reintroduces himself as Michael. "Nice to meet you, Michael," says Jeniah, making no further eye contact with him nor the magazine, and before teetering away into the crowd, even more timidly and hurriedly than before. She thanks Michael for letting her read the magazine. "You're most welcome," he says, with double-raised eyebrows, as if to encourage her for a future time. Jeniah picked up on his friendly suggestion and felt spooked, although didn't hang around to further engage. Instead, she made her way to the coffee shop where she was originally going to get her employer her favourite latte. She was already 15 minutes late.